phones and find your seats. We are pleased to introduce our first panel of the day, titled AI for Emergency Response and Beyond. Moderating this discussion will be Jean Meserve, host of SCSP's NatSec Tech podcast. Please welcome our panelists Kim Gajewski, Policy Manager at Google Cloud, Michael Martin, CEO of Rapid SOS, and Laura Walker McDonald, Senior Advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Great to have all of you here with us this morning. So as a reporter, I covered all kinds of emergencies, from plane and traffic crashes to terrorist attacks to tornadoes and hurricanes. And over again, I saw how flawed or missing information could really impede emergency response. AI is helping to address that, and we're going to discuss this with this great panel right now. It's my impression, a quick roundtable question here, that AI is really a game changer in terms of crisis management. Laura, do you want to start that?
Sure. And first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here with all of you in your very comfy seats, but I think we'll keep you awake. So I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross. Has anyone heard of the American Red Cross, first of all? Yeah. Okay, so we're the international Swiss organization that responds to conflict, as Jean's pointed out. And AI, I think, shows great promise for crisis responders of all stripes. So the ability to take a really big, messy data set that no human could ever look through in time and make sense of it, or the potential for new drugs or new ways to increase crop yields for plants that grow in difficult regions so we can increase the availability of grain, that kind of thing. There's lots and lots of promise. There are also big changes coming in, new entrants into marketplaces, including onto the battlefield, particularly in the private sector, and just new combinations that potentially could be helpful for people who are caught up in conflict and could be harmful too.
Kim?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think, fundamentally the entire way that humanity has collected and had access to information has changed. And so it's a really exciting time for AI because of the capabilities it brings to these new mountains and troves of information that we have access to, so that AI can actually help us make that information a lot more usable and useful to the people that need it.
Michael, thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I'll just ground us a little bit in the scope of the challenge and I think the opportunity set for AI. So statistically, last year here in the United States, about 1 in 3 American fatalities occurred during some form of an emergency. That's about 3,000 a day. And so the implications of our legacy response infrastructure and systems, which for the last 50 years have largely been analog. In the United States, we have 240 million 911 incidents a year. They all traverse a 1960s analog base phone system, where traditionally 911 doesn't even know your name. Globally, it's about 20 million people that are having one of these horrendous emergencies that ends in a fatality every single year. So we have a massive challenge that we need to solve, and I totally agree. I think we're already seeing the power of AI to transform that. I'm sure we'll get into that today, but there's a lot more work to be done there.
Kim, I want you to talk a little bit, if you could, about what Google's doing that helps forecast what's coming down the pike.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the emergency management is a cycle, right? You have a preparedness stage, a response phase, a recovery phase, mitigation phase. And AI, we've seen applications and value throughout that entire life cycle. And so, as an example, in preparedness, we are finding ways to use programs like FloodWatch, which uses river gauges to predict flooding around the world, and FireSat, which uses multispectral satellite imagery to help detect wildfires as they start, as they spread, as they move around. And we're finding that AI is, with our modeling, able to give first responders more time to prepare. So we're able to use that information to predict where something might be an incident occurring. And then in the response phase, we're finding that AI is superpowering the ways that we can help responders make timely decisions. So we're actually able to, for example, combine different types of data sets like satellite imagery that remotely assesses damage with information about areas that are particularly vulnerable or experiencing high levels of poverty, such that a response to that could be more targeted and precise and help those vulnerable communities get back on their feet faster. And then from the mitigation perspective, looking at the ways that we can use all of this historic information to make better decisions, to mitigate those consequences and those risks in the future. So AI is really plugging into that full spectrum of the capabilities, and we're seeing that from combining all of these different new data sets and technologies.
And the precision has improved tremendously.
Tremendous precision. And so I think going back to the point of, no human could ever work with this type of data. It's super true. As we get more precise, as we get larger volumes and quantities of really high quality data, for example, our FireSat program, we're still in the works, but we're trying to launch satellites that will be able to provide 5 by 5 meter coverage of imagery, very high quality resolution imagery for satellites every 20 minutes globally. That's the vision once it's fully realized. That amount of imagery, that amount of data every 20 minutes is impossible for a human to utilize with any kind of meaningful way. So that's where something like AI is absolutely critical in superpowering the usefulness of that information.
Laura, ICRC is also using satellite imagery in crisis response. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, we did. We obviously also sought to embrace AI to help us to respond to people who need support. And we started by developing a policy to help guide us so that our use of this technology is grounded in our humanitarian principles of humanity and neutrality, impartiality, independence. And so once we had that, we did start looking at different use cases. And one of them was looking at satellite imagery to be able to and analyze what the likely population density was in a specific place. And the reason we needed to do that is because there isn't great data on the ground in some low resource environments, places where there's maybe not a census or where there's been a lot of movement lately. So we put time into developing a tool, a model that could do this, that we built in-house. We have requirements that we keep all of our data confidential, so we had to run it in-house. And what we found was that the proof of concept was there, but the sustainability and being able to mitigate the risks, being able to make sure that it was not error prone, that was something we actually couldn't afford to do. We didn't have the manpower, and we didn't have the person power, and we didn't have the compute to be able to sustain it. So what we ended up doing in the end was building a tool that helped us evaluate existing data sets around population density to see which was the most reliable. So we found a workaround, but we did put it through our paces, and we are still using AI to do things like digitize our archives, and we have an internal chatbot to help us answer questions around international humanitarian law and other things.
Explain why population density is so important to the work you do.
That's a great question. So we need to know where people are. As I mentioned, in some places, like I used to work a lot in East Africa when I was running an SMS startup, a text messaging startup, actually. And what we found was that some of these places don't have great systems anyway. So we don't have a lot of sort of the census, the data about where people are. Some people who are more vulnerable, who may not have a mobile phone, they may not exist in the sort of formal systems of society, they might not have ID. They can sort of float along below the radar, and you might never know that they were there. You might not have that formal record. But if you look at satellite imagery, the theory was we could look at like density of buildings, size of buildings, and do some estimates. I will say, though, when something changes, so when there's a disaster or when there's a crisis like a conflict, people move really quickly. They have to evacuate damaged buildings, or they have to get out of an area and move somewhere else. And then I think all bets are off. So one of the big challenges that we see, not only for us, but actually for other organizations who need to be able to know where civilians are, like the military, for example, if they're using AI to help them understand where civilians are so that they can make sure that they are trying to avoid targeting them by accident or in the course of the activities that they're doing, they may find that the data sets are not there to enable the AI to give you good recommendations around that. So that's a big challenge for us. And
satellites can't tell you everything.
They cannot.
You still need people on the ground, correct, to verify who are combatants, who are civilians, et cetera?
So you've cut to my best advice for this, which is I think when we're testing these kinds of things, make sure you're ground truthing what the system is telling you so you can check, how right did we get this? And also in case there is a problem that you're catching it. And I think that kind of research and testing as you're rolling out new technologies is always my best advice for any kind of technology, but also for anything that's like an AI recommendation engine.
So, Laura, given the mission of the ACRC, are there certain ways that you are avoiding using AI, staying away from it?
Yeah, that's another great question. So I mentioned our principles of humanity and neutrality and impartiality. So for us, what that translates to, I think you can find our AI policy on the web if you're interested, but what that translates to, for example, is making sure that we are centering humans in what we do, not decentering them with AI. So always human decision-making, human connection, and for the military, that means also human accountability, human judgment and agency in decision-making. Even if you're using AI, it's a tool. It shouldn't displace you in the decision-making process. And one other example, neutrality for us includes the idea of not introducing bias into your decision-making. Now, we know that AI has struggled with having bias built into it because, in part because of the data sets that are available to it. We haven't solved that problem yet.
Michael, explain exactly what Rapid SOS does.
Rapid SOS is a unicorn AI tech startup originally out of MIT. We basically power, we're integrated with 5.3 billion devices, so Apple, Google, Meta, Uber, Instacart, Grubhub, Honeywell, fire alarms, et cetera, 165 million camera feeds, et cetera. And so during an emergency, we correlate and stream all that information together and then package it up in a way that's actionable for 22,600 state and local and federal governments in 11 countries. So we've done that 1 billion times, and we build and train the AI platform to automate a lot of that sort of work. So if you call 911 in one of 11 countries, we're kind of the AI layer underneath the hood that kind of manages what first responders are allocated where, et cetera, and the kind of tech behind that.
Can you give us a specific example of where it's made a difference?
Yeah, I mean, a lot in natural disasters. Some of the more consumer ways that you may have experienced this. So like 2 weeks ago, Apple announced that the new Apple Watch Ultra can connect over satellite into 911 now. We've worked a lot with companies like Apple to facilitate these sorts of more advanced connectivity solutions. So during the Maui wildfires or during Hurricane Helene, we had the terrestrial infrastructure fail. And so we had our satellite, first sets of satellite saves as an example. So in Helene, you had rural first responder agencies that were on third level backup on Starlink. And then we had citizens that had newer iPhones that were connecting over satellite as examples. One other example given in Helene is you've had these massive spikes in 911 call volume. So people are sitting on hold with 911. And I think there's a lot of power on AI to kind of be like a co-pilot to our first responders. And so we're seeing actually in the most severe situations, actually AI's ability to kind of triage that incident and get first responders headed if a 911 telecommunicator is busy assisting another citizen.
So I'm not a tech person, but I've been in emergencies, and what I've seen in the past is that there was heavy reliance on television, radio, and phones to disperse information to people in a disaster zone. They don't have power. They can't turn on a television. Their radio runs out of juice. Their phone runs out of juice. How do you deal with that kind of a situation? Have you found a workaround? You mentioned the satellite, but if the phone doesn't have any charge,
yeah, so I think that like generally in disasters, we have real challenges where if you think of it, the traditional emergency response flow is basically serial, right? So human gets out your phone, calls 911, traditionally over, still an analog. The last mile of most 911 response globally remains analog. It's really quite remarkable. It's one of the last pieces of kind of analog infrastructure in the United States. So if anything fails there, there's no response. Then you have a human-to-human conversation, which only scales at the number of humans that are available. So when you have a major disaster sort of event, particularly like a Hurricane Helene, where I think we did not forecast the degree of flooding that occurred in the Carolinas and in the Appalachian Mountains. There was a lot of challenges there with responding to that versus in Florida where they had more experience kind of with that. So now you're stuck on hold. 4.6 million 911 calls were on hold last year as an example. There's a 22% staffing crisis in 911 today. Then from there, we typically rely on radio dispatch out to first responders. So in the LA wildfires, some of the terrestrial radio networks failed in the canyons in LA, which caused communications and comms challenges. So what's cool is now every one of those layers has backup satellite connectivity, and the devices themselves are getting much more capable. And then we can do a lot with AI to automate and triage, even if you lose signal strength or something like that. So
you mentioned the flood of 911 calls that come in. Does your technology help triage those so the most important calls are getting to operators?
Yeah, so we're seeing kind of. I think we believe that in a future world where sensors will detect emergencies before humans can, and they'll understand them faster than humans can. quietly, this is occurring, and many of us just don't realize it. So, I see several folks with their phones, like your phone automatically detects a car crash now. Your Apple Watch automatically detects a fall or a car accident, et cetera. So this technology is becoming fairly ubiquitous today, and we're seeing about 20% of all 911 incidents are now sensor initiated. And RapidSOS RAI helps verify that. Like, after this technology was released, there was a massive influx of car accidents on ski slopes in the United States, as an example. I think the engineering team at Apple was very smart. They realized, like, hey, you can't have a car crash if you're stationary, so I can't trigger that by slamming my arm down. But if you're skiing at, 30 miles per hour, we hadn't thought through kind of that use case. So these sorts of things are now been addressed through AI. So.
Are there ethical concerns when you're drawing data from people's private devices here? Have they given you permission to do this?
Yeah, so we don't have access to any data unless you've actively initiated a response. So whether that's you've gotten out your phone and dialed 911 or you've activated one of these features in your devices to facilitate that response. So certainly there would be, I think, without that being true.
So you mentioned that you share data in, 11 countries and with how many?
22,000.
22,000. What about Google? Who do you share the information with? It's not useful if it's tightly held.
Yeah, none of the capabilities that we're developing would be possible without an entire global partnership. So it's almost the opposite question of, if you have a use case, if you have a need or an idea for how this information could be useful or how some of this technology might be able to be channeled or applied to a specific use case, Google has a wonderful approachable partnership mindset where we are very interested in understanding and applying different research use cases. So we have entire teams that are focused on partnerships. We have, a global focus. So we're not just interested in U.S. problems. We're also focused on problems around the world and with different types of communities. And for us, the most interesting challenges are the ones where they are these, it's the car crash on the ski slope, but extrapolated to, this is a unique challenge in an underserved part of the world. And so we're very interested in making that not the case anymore, right? That whatever technology we're developing is useful, accessible, and available to a variety of different situations around the world. And so the partnership element of it is one of our most exciting pieces of it, where we recognize and appreciate that partners have these unique perspectives. They bring different data sets. They bring different levels of expertise. And our teams are constantly learning from each other. And ultimately that yields a better product and a more sustainable product, because we're not just in it by ourselves and we're not just sustaining something for the good of Google. It really is supposed to be and intended to be for the good of global humanity.
Laura, is ICRC using some of Google's product?
I'm not sure that we are, but we do speak to Google all the time, as we speak to many entities in fora like this. And I will say that companies, I think, are. I think the ski slope example is a great example of accidentally testing something in production. Like, if I may make a techie joke, like, you don't want to be in that situation where something is going wrong and you hadn't predicted it. So I think when technology gets used anywhere in the world, but in a place where there's a vulnerable community who might be impacted, it's great to get a phone call from a company saying, can you help us think through some of these use cases, even if they're edge cases, which, things that might not happen very often. Because we might be able to, and partners, like you mentioned, might be able to foresee risks that others can't. So risks of certain kinds of escalating rhetoric on social media leading to violence in the real world, or the potential that we spot sometimes for use cases in technology to actually be not in compliance with international law. And so we have to sort of point out these kinds of things, like the requirement not to have exposed prisoners of war to public ridicule, for example, by having a picture of them on social media, which might be the best of intentions. But back to AI, I think as a technologist, what I always suggest is, if you think you're going to do something, sit down and think who might be impacted by it, what do you think might unfold, and then try and spot the opportunities, but try and spot the risks. And if there's a significant risk of a significant harm, how can you mitigate those, and how could you do that? And organizations like the ICRC can be helpful in thinking those things through.
Michael, Laura mentioned social media. I'm wondering if you monitor that at all as part of your system.
Yeah, there's some leaders in that space like Data and a variety of other companies. We're probably more focused on when a sensor or a human detects an emergency, facilitating that. I will say social media has become quite impactful in disaster response. Obviously, you extensively covered Hurricane Katrina, which had just a profound impact on human life in New Orleans, over 1,000 fatalities. And if we compare that with Hurricane Harvey, which was a similar magnitude storm with very severe flooding in Houston, Texas, but had less than 100 fatalities. Why did you get 10x more magnitude between Katrina and Harvey? In both systems, 911 was totally overwhelmed. New York Times did a lot of reporting on hour-long hold times in both scenarios, et cetera. But social media existed for Harvey versus it didn't in Katrina, or it was very early. So there was obviously this massive citizen-led effort led by the Cajun Navy to try to rescue people in private boats and stuff, and there were thousands of saves that, in the prior world wouldn't have existed. So I think social media, you all would probably have a more sophisticated perspective, Laura, but it feels like it's like a real opportunity set. So.
Yeah, having been in Katrina, I've often said if Twitter had been then what it later became, authorities would have been aware what was happening in the Ninth Ward because people would have been tweeting out pictures of the levees and the water coming into their homes instead of, packing up and going home at the end of the day and leaving people on rooftops. Not that I have strong opinions about this or anything. But it would have made a world of difference if social media had been active. Kim, I'm wondering about a current situation. The U.S. Weather Service is critical to forecasting what sort of disasters may be on their way. Just in the past week, they've been monitoring 2 major hurricanes churning in the Atlantic Ocean, and they're not at full strength. Are you cooperating with the National Weather Service in some way to provide them with imagery or analysis that they may not otherwise have?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And so, with all things in emergency management, it's a constellation of partners and public sector, private sector, companies, organizations. They're all coming together to solve these crises and work together on this. So, one of the things that I love most about a lot of these tools that Google has created is that there are a lot of these that are free or publicly accessible tools. If you're interested in getting an API, we can work with you on that, and you can actually then incorporate and utilize some of these tools, some of our models, some of our data for your own purposes. And so in the specific example here, I think, we are collaborating and working with a variety of different USG partners and trying to find ways to maximize the impact that they can have in a reduced, in a constrained environment. That is not something, unfortunately, that is unique to the Weather Service. That's something that critical infrastructure owners and operators have felt for years. Different disaster response organizations and entities, both in the public sector and private sector, are always fighting with resource constraints. And so, I think we are looking for ways and opportunities to give people access to information to help them make their own decisions and develop their own technology that can help these situations, but then also find opportunities where Google might have an ability to surge or offer additional levels of support or coverage, or create a product or solution that would address an emerging gap in some of these challenge areas. And I think AI has a lot of promise in that, where it's never going to replace the people, but it might superpower some of those people to do more in that constrained environment, take faster action, buy more time that they would otherwise not have just because of what they're, the environment that they're operating in.
Michael, do you agree that people are still going to be essential?
Yeah, in fact, I think probably we can all agree. For all the hype of AI, 2 weeks ago we had there was a serial rapist in North Carolina that had been running loose for several months, and there was real challenges catching. And a woman was in the middle of being sexually assaulted and managed to get her phone and call 911, but couldn't speak. It was, I had a chance to speak with the 911 telecommunicator. Her name was Vanessa, who managed that incident, and she just had this sixth sense that it's hard to imagine it feels like we're a long way away from AI being able to sense that, hey, something was up. And this 911 telecommunicator had the wherewithal to not speak, not to raise attention, not to be like 911, hello, is everything okay? No, she just listened and she heard this start to unfold, and then she used our AI to coordinate the response, get, units were there in 3 minutes and prevented this and arrested this individual. But I mean, for some of these sorts of roles, certainly like the role of a 911 telecommunicator or first responder, I mean, I think we're seeing drones and other tools to assist, but it's never going to be able to take, I think, that sixth human sense for these deeply kind of human moments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would like each one of you to look to the future and give us your best guess on where you think we'll be in terms of using AI for crisis and emergency response. Let's say in 5 years, 10 years. Laura, you want to start?
Yeah, well, maybe, I mean, that's such a compelling story, and thank you for sharing that. And I just want to agree with you that I think we must keep the human at the center. And I'll tell you where I hope it will go, which is that I hope that both in response and also in defense uses, that AI is something that helps the human to do a better job, including understanding where civilians are and trying to avoid harm to civilians as much as possible, or being able to get as much help to them as possible. And that will require improving the technology, because it cannot do that right now. And one of the main reasons is the lack of data about where folks are. And, maybe we need to turn to sensing. Does that then increase surveillance on those folks, which may also lead to other risks? So I think we really have to sort out, based on where do we want to get to, how are we going to get there, how do we mitigate the risks? So I think working, to try and improve the technology with humans at the center is really where I hope we'll be.
Kim?
So I hope that the future is boring. The best way to put it.
That's unlikely.
I hope that we reach a place where we are able to forecast with enough time to implement proper planning or mitigation strategies such that if and when a natural disaster occurs or some kinds of other phenomenon occurs, the community is prepared for it. They have taken every measure that they can to minimize the impact to it, and they're going to be more resilient coming out of it. That is the best case scenario. But I also think that, and I hope that people start to realize that AI is going to be as powerful as your imagination can make it. And two pieces of that, and the questions that I hope people leave and ask themselves is, one, if you're looking down a mountain of data, asking yourself how AI could use this data. Like, you think you've got a handle on, I get this information, I do this step with it. Think creatively. How else might that information be helpful and useful to someone else or to a different use case, or apply it in a different way? If you're sitting on these mountains of data that could be helpful, think about ways that AI, just give it a try, see where it could go. And then conversely, if you're sitting at a crossroads of a challenge, like we don't have ability to cover population densities with any kind of fidelity in an area, how can AI overcome that gap without this need to deploy invasive technology? Like, what types of other ancillary information or what types of modeling or predictive forecasting can we deploy AI to solve so that we don't need to have global coverage, this, precise level of information? We've seen a lot of ways that AI can actually make that leap based off of some other data and make those inferences and be quite accurate with it, so that we don't need to get into a place where the whole world has to be covered in sensors, or all of the data doesn't have to be known. We can actually help extrapolate some of that even in the absence of some of that information. Michael, look into the crystal ball.
Yeah, well, I think I'm super optimistic, actually. And I'll start with maybe just so if we look back over the last quarter century, so since 2000 here in the United States, you think about all the technology advances. Basically, the internet got proliferate. We all have smartphones now, all this technology. And then you ask, what has the impact been on human life expectancy in the United States? And I'm going to get the stat probably slightly off, but it's approximately 30 days. So in 25 years, with all this technological transformation, we're living 30 days longer. I am seeing how we are in the middle of what I believe is the greatest renaissance ever on that. So it used to be, so 1 in 3 Americans are dying on the phone with 911 or in the moments afterwards. This is historically 911 didn't know your name or your location. We had thousands of people who die on the phone with 911 because they don't even know where you are. Well, now you can FaceTime 911. It's amazing. And we're doing thousands of drone missions a day where you call 911 and we're flying a drone and we're dropping Narcan and AED and a tourniquet. right there, right? So we're starting to see the impact on that. But I think what's super exciting is where you were started is like actually for the first time, we're actually thinking about a paradigm shift. So for the past, 500 years, we thought about emergencies in one way. They happen, and then you respond, right? So like, in the 1800s, you run to the neighbor's house. In the 1920s, you call the bucket brigade. In 2025, an emergency happens, and you call 911, and you ask someone for help. And I think we're on the cusp of a world where we can actually start to predict and prevent certain types of emergencies in advance, notably car accidents and heart attacks. And I'll just wrap by saying, like, it's going to be so amazing. Like, turns out, like, one of the greatest things you can spend money on if you are a health insurance company is on paying high school kids to shovel driveways during a snowstorm. Snow causes heart attacks. We did some of our graduate work at Harvard on this, and it's not equally distributed. You can predict it. And it costs a heart attack. Treating a heart attack costs $50,000. Paying some kid to shovel the driveway costs $50. So, if you're 1% accurate on that heart attack prediction, that's $500 of net value, $50 to do it. It's a 10x return on investment. There are no 10x returns on investments in the health insurance world anymore. So we're on the cusp of like real transformation, I think, on this stuff.
Of course, you have to find the kid who's willing to shovel. That's getting a little bit tougher. Michael, Kim, and Laura, thank you all for your insights today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.